The autumn rain fell in relentless sheets against the windows of Millstone Hall, drumming a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the restless thoughts of Miss Eliza Church as she stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, watching the assembled guests with the practiced detachment of one who had long since ceased expecting anything remarkable from such gatherings. At 30 years of age, she had attended more balls, dinners, and country house parties than she cared to count, and yet here she stood once more, her deep green gown a quiet rebellion against the pastels deemed appropriate for unmarried women, her auburn hair swept into an elegant arrangement that owed nothing to current fashion and everything to her own stubborn preferences. The Millstone Autumn Ball had been a fixture of county society for generations, drawing the finest families from 3 shires to celebrate the harvest and, more pressingly, to parade their eligible offspring before one another in the eternal dance of matrimonial manoeuvring. Eliza had ceased being paraded years ago, her sharp tongue and sharper opinions having effectively removed her from serious consideration by any gentleman seeking a biddable wife. This suited her entirely, though her mother's sighs of disappointment had become a familiar accompaniment to every social occasion. Lady Church stood across the room, deep in conversation with their hostess, Lady Millstone, her animated gestures suggesting she was recounting some tale of domestic triumph or social observation. Eliza's younger sister, the sweet and universally admired Catherine, was dancing with the eldest Millstone's son, her pale blue gown swirling like morning mist as they moved through the figures of the country dance. Catherine would marry well, everyone agreed. Catherine was everything a young lady ought to be. Eliza turned her attention to the rain-streaked windows, finding more comfort in the storm's honesty than in the calculated pleasantries surrounding her. She had learned long ago that society valued appearance over substance, compliance over conviction, and she had made her peace with existing at its margins rather than contorting herself to fit its narrow expectations. The sudden hush that fell over the ballroom drew her attention back to the entrance, where she felt rather than saw the arrival that had caused such collective intake of breath. She did not need to look to know who had entered. The particular quality of the silence, the way conversations stuttered and reformed around a new gravitational centre, told her everything. Lord Marcus Lancaster, Earl of Brincliffe, had arrived. Eliza's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the stem of her crystal glass as she finally allowed herself to turn toward the doorway. He stood framed in the entrance as though posed for a portrait, tall and commanding in impeccably tailored evening clothes. His dark hair slightly dishevelled from the journey through the storm, his grey eyes sweeping the room, with the cool assessment of a man accustomed to being the most powerful presence in any gathering. 10 years. It had been 10 years since their first disastrous encounter, 10 years of cold civility at unavoidable social functions, 10 years of barbed exchanges and pointed avoidance, 10 years since the night that had transformed them from strangers into something far more complicated. Enemies. The memory rose unbidden, sharp as the day it had been forged. She had been 20 years old, bright with the confidence of youth and newly emerged into society. He had been 28, already bearing the weight of his title after his father's unexpected death, already developing the reputation for cold arrogance that would become his defining characteristic. They had been introduced at Lady Pemberton's spring ball, and something in his dismissive glance had ignited a spark of defiance in her chest. When he had condescended to dance with her, clearly fulfilling some social obligation rather than expressing genuine interest, she had responded to his bored observations with increasingly pointed commentary, until he had looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. What had followed was a conversation that had begun as verbal sparring and escalated into something approaching genuine exchange. For one evening, she had glimpsed something beneath his aristocratic reserve, a sharp intelligence, a dry wit that matched her own, a fleeting vulnerability when he spoke of his recent inheritance and its burdens. She had been foolish enough to believe she had found a kindred spirit. She had been foolish enough to confide in her cousin Eleanor the next day, speaking of the unexpected connection she had felt, the possibility that perhaps this formidable Earl might prove to be something other than what society expected. Eleanor, as Eliza would later learn, had carried this confidence directly to Lord Lancaster's intended, Lady Margaret Hartley, who had wasted no time in ensuring that the Earl knew exactly what the presumptuous Miss Church imagined about their single dance. Eliza had arrived at the Cavendish musical 3 days later to find herself the subject of amused whispers and pitying glances. Lord Lancaster had been present, his expression carved from ice, as he cut her dead in front of the assembled company, refusing to acknowledge her existence when they came face to face near the refreshment table. The humiliation had been complete, made worse by the knowledge that she had brought it upon herself by daring to hope, by daring to speak that hope aloud. She had retreated to the terrace, fighting back tears of mortification, only to have him follow her moments later. His words still echoed in her memory, delivered in that cold, precise voice that betrayed no emotion whatsoever. "Miss Church, I understand you have entertained certain fantasies regarding our acquaintance. Allow me to disabuse you of any such notions. I have no interest in provincial young ladies who mistake a single dance for a declaration of intent. I suggest you direct your matrimonial ambitions toward gentlemen more suited to your station and expectations." She had wanted to explain, to defend herself, to tell him that she had never harboured matrimonial ambitions, that she had simply been foolish enough to think she had found someone who saw past the social performance to the person beneath. Instead, something had hardened within her, crystallising into a cold fury that matched his own. "My lord," she had replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "I assure you that any fantasies I might have entertained regarding your character have been thoroughly corrected. I now see you exactly as you are, a cold, arrogant man so convinced of his own superiority that he cannot recognise genuine conversation when he encounters it. I shall certainly direct my attention elsewhere, as I prefer the company of those capable of human warmth." They had parted as enemies that night, and enemies they had remained through 10 long years, their mutual antipathy becoming a source of endless speculation and entertainment for the ton. Every encounter produced fresh ammunition for the gossips, from the time Eliza had loudly praised a book Lord Lancaster had publicly dismissed, to the memorable occasion when he had bid against her for a painting at auction, driving the price to astronomical heights simply to prevent her from acquiring it. Now, watching him cross the ballroom toward their host, Eliza felt the familiar weight of their history settle around her shoulders like a cloak. The years had changed him, she observed with clinical detachment. The youthful arrogance had hardened into something more formidable, the handsome features now bearing the marks of whatever burdens an earl of his consequence must carry. Silver threaded through his dark hair at the temples, and lines had formed around his eyes that might have been from laughter in another man, but in Lord Lancaster surely came from maintaining his perpetual expression of cold disdain. He had not married. This fact had not escaped Eliza's notice over the years, though she refused to examine why she kept such careful track of his circumstances. Lady Margaret Hartley had married someone else within a year of their fateful encounter, and despite the endless parade of eligible young ladies thrust in his path, Lord Lancaster had remained stubbornly unattached. The gossips attributed this to impossible standards, to a heart rendered incapable of feeling by his icy temperament. Eliza had her own theories, none of which she permitted herself to dwell upon. "Eliza, my dear." Her mother appeared at her elbow, her expression carrying the particular combination of hope and anxiety that always preceded some maternal scheme. "Lady Millstone has arranged the most charming seating for dinner. You are to be placed beside Lord Lancaster." Eliza's glass nearly slipped from her fingers. "I beg your pardon." Her mother's smile held a determined brightness. "It seems Lord Lancaster specifically requested the arrangement. Lady Millstone believes he may finally be ready to put aside whatever misunderstanding has existed between you all these years. This is a wonderful opportunity, Eliza. At 30, you cannot afford to, Mother. Eliza's voice was low but firm. Whatever Lord Lancaster's reasons for this request, I assure you they have nothing to do with matrimonial interest and everything to do with his endless campaign to discomfort me. I will not provide him with another evening's entertainment at my expense. Lady Church's expression shifted to one of weary frustration. You are determined to remain alone forever, then? To spend your remaining years as a spinster aunt to Catherine's children, all because of a decade-old slight that no one but you remembers? It was not a slight, Eliza replied quietly. It was a revelation of character, both his and my own. I will not pretend otherwise simply because it would be convenient. Before her mother could respond, a familiar deep voice spoke from disturbingly close proximity. Lady Church, Miss Church, I trust I am not interrupting. Eliza turned to find Lord Lancaster standing before them, having crossed the ballroom with the silent efficiency of a predator. Up close, she could see that the years had indeed changed him. The coldness in his grey eyes was tempered now by something she could not quite identify. Weariness, perhaps, or the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent too long maintaining walls against the world. Lord Lancaster. She managed a curtsy that was precisely correct and not a fraction more. What an unexpected pleasure to find you at a social gathering. I had heard you had largely abandoned such entertainments in favour of brooding alone at your estate. A flash of something anger or amusement, she could not tell which, crossed his features. And I had heard you had largely abandoned attempts at civility in favour of saying whatever shocking thing entered your mind. It seems the gossips were accurate on at least one count. Lady Church made a small, distressed sound and excused herself with transparent haste, leaving Eliza alone with her nemesis amid the swirling colours and sounds of the ballroom. They stood in silence for a moment, two combatants assessing each other across the field of their shared history. You requested to be seated beside me at dinner, Eliza said finally. Why? Lord Lancaster's expression gave nothing away. Perhaps I wished to discover if 10 years had mellowed your disposition. It has not. I see that. A pause. And yet, something in you has changed, Miss Church. I have been watching you this evening. She raised an eyebrow. How unsettling. You used to stand at the edge of gatherings like a lioness preparing to hunt, he continued, ignoring her interruption. All coiled energy and barely contained disdain. Tonight you stand like someone who has made peace with her captivity. The observation struck closer to truth than she would have liked. Perhaps I have simply grown tired of fighting battles that cannot be won. A curious philosophy from the woman who once told me she would rather be despised for her honesty than admired for her compliance. The fact that he remembered her exact words from a conversation a decade past should not have affected her. And yet Eliza felt something shift in her chest, some carefully maintained barrier developing the finest of cracks. People change, Lord Lancaster. Circumstances change. I am not the naive young woman who believed that speaking truth would be rewarded rather than punished. No, he agreed, and something in his voice had softened almost imperceptibly. You are not. But I find myself wondering if what replaced her is entirely an improvement. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and around them couples began moving toward the floor. Lord Lancaster extended his hand with a formality that somehow felt like a challenge. Dance with me, Miss Church. Eliza stared at his outstretched hand as though it were a serpent. Why? Because we have spent 10 years as enemies, and I find myself suddenly weary of it. Because you are the only woman in this room whose conversation does not bore me to tears. Because I wish to know if the connection I felt 10 years ago was real or merely the product of my imagination. The honesty of his words stole her breath. She had spent a decade convincing herself that she had imagined that first evening, that the spark of understanding between them had been nothing more than youthful fancy. To hear him acknowledge it, to hear him speak of it as something real, something remembered, was more disorienting than any of his previous attacks. "You humiliated me," she said quietly. "You made me a laughingstock before all of society. I know." There was no defense in his tone, no justification. "I have regretted it every day since. And yet, you have spent 10 years continuing to antagonize me at every opportunity. As have you." He had not withdrawn his hand. "We have been locked in a war of our own making, Miss Church, each too proud to be the first to lay down arms. I am laying them down now. Will you meet me halfway?" The ballroom seemed to recede around them, the music and chatter fading to a distant hum as Eliza confronted the possibility that everything she had believed about this man, about herself, about the history between them, might be incomplete. Her hand moved of its own accord, settling into his palm with a familiarity that 10 years of enmity had not erased. The first touch sent a jolt through her system, a recognition that felt like coming home to a place she had never known existed. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain, and he led her onto the floor. Dancing with Lord Lancaster was nothing like she remembered, and everything like she had secretly imagined during years of denying she thought of him at all. He moved with controlled grace, guiding her through, the steps with a confidence that invited rather than demanded her trust. The hand at her waist was a point of heat through the fabric of her gown, and she found herself acutely aware of his proximity, the subtle scent of sandalwood and rain that clung to him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first turn around the floor, neither spoke. They moved in silence, learning each other's rhythms, adjusting to the surprising ease with which their bodies fell into synchrony. It was Eliza who finally broke the quiet. "What happened?" she asked softly, "to make you lay down your arms tonight?" Lord Lancaster's grey eyes met hers, and she saw in them a vulnerability she had never expected to witness. "My mother is dying," he said simply. The words hit her like a physical blow. She had met the Dowager Countess of Brincliffe only once years ago, but she remembered a woman of sharp wit and warm heart, so unlike her cold son that Eliza had wondered how such different temperaments could share blood. "I am sorry," she said, and meant it. "The doctors give her weeks, perhaps a month." He guided her through a turn, his grip tightening almost imperceptibly. "She has spent the last several years asking me the same question. Why I have never married, never found happiness, never moved beyond the rigid walls I built around myself after my father's death. I have never had an answer that satisfied her." Eliza waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. "Last week, she told me something that I have not been able to escape. She said that the only time she ever saw me truly alive was the night I came home from Lady Pemberton's ball, 10 years ago. She said I spoke of a young woman I had met, a woman whose wit and fire had made me forget, for one evening, that I was supposed to be the cold, controlled Earl of Brincliffe. She said she had waited a decade for me to find that feeling again, and she was beginning to fear she would die without seeing it." The waltz continued around them, other couples twirling past in a blur of colour and sound, but Eliza saw only the man before her, the cracks in his careful armour revealing something raw and real beneath. "You spoke of me," she said, hardly able to believe it, "to your mother." "I did." His jaw tightened. "And then I destroyed any chance of discovering what might have grown from that connection because I was too proud, too afraid, to admit that a single evening with a provincial young lady had affected me more than years of careful courtship with women deemed appropriate to my station. When Lady Margaret told me what you had said to your cousin, I was furious, but not at your presumption. I was furious because you had seen through me, because you had recognized something real when I had spent my entire life pretending nothing was. So you attacked me instead." Eliza's voice was steady, though her heart raced. "You humiliated me publicly, because you were afraid of what you felt privately. It is unforgivable." He did not flinch from the accusation. "I know. And yet, I am asking you to consider forgiving me anyway. Not because I deserve it, but because I find that I cannot face whatever time I have left, whether my own death comes in 50 years or 5, knowing that I let pride and fear cost me the only person who ever made me feel truly seen." The music swelled around them as the waltz neared its conclusion. Eliza's thoughts churned with a decade of resentment, warring against the unexpected ache of recognition, the sense that perhaps they had both been prisoners of that long-ago night, each blaming the other for wounds they had inflicted upon themselves. The dance ended. Lord Lancaster stepped back, releasing her with visible reluctance. "Dinner is being announced," he said, his voice returning to its usual controlled register, though his eyes remained unguarded. "We will have the length of the meal to continue this conversation, or to retreat to safer ground. The choice is yours, Miss Church." Eliza stood at the edge of the ballroom, watching him walk toward the dining room, and faced the most terrifying decision of her carefully guarded life. Whether to maintain the walls that had protected her for a decade, or to risk everything on the possibility that her oldest enemy might also be her truest match. The dining room of Millstone Hall glittered with silver and crystal, candles casting warm light across the assembled company as footmen moved silently between chairs, ensuring each guest was seated according to Lady Millstone's meticulous arrangements. Eliza found her place beside Lord Lancaster, with a mixture of dread and anticipation that made her fingers tremble slightly as she arranged her napkin. The first course arrived, an elegant soup that Eliza barely tasted, her attention consumed by the man seated at her left. He engaged their other dinner companions with the polished courtesy expected of his station, answering questions about his estate, offering opinions on the political developments of the day, all while somehow conveying to Eliza, through the briefest of glances, that his true attention remained fixed on her. It was not until the fish course that they found a moment of semi-privacy, their neighbours temporarily absorbed in conversations with those on their opposite sides. "You have not married either," Lord Lancaster observed quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "In 10 years I have watched a parade of gentlemen seek your hand, and you have refused them all." Eliza took a careful sip of wine. "You have been watching me rather closely for someone who professed complete disinterest in my existence." "I have been watching you," he admitted, as one watches an opponent across a chessboard. "And I have wondered, more often than I care to acknowledge, whether your refusals stemmed from high standards or from the same affliction that has kept me solitary." "And what affliction is that?" "The inability to find anyone who measures up to a memory." He turned to look at her directly, and the intensity in his grey eyes made her breath catch. A memory of a single evening, a single conversation, that somehow set the standard against which all subsequent encounters fell short. Eliza set down her wineglass with deliberate care. "You cannot expect me to believe that you have spent 10 years comparing other women to me unfavourably." "I expect nothing, Miss Church. I am merely telling you the truth, perhaps for the first time since we met. You may do with it what you will." The footman cleared the fish course and presented the meat, a beautifully arranged presentation that drew murmurs of appreciation from the table. Eliza stared at her plate without seeing it, her mind racing through years of careful certainty, now suddenly uncertain. If what he said was true, then they had both wasted a decade in a war that neither had truly wanted, each too proud to admit that their hostility was merely armour against something far more threatening, the possibility of genuine connection. "Tell me," she said slowly, "what you remember of that first evening." "Everything." The word was immediate, unequivocal. "I remember that you wore a gown of pale gold that made your hair look like autumn fire. I remember that you laughed at a comment I made about Lord Pemberton's hunting dogs, and the sound of it made something in my chest tighten in a way I had never experienced. I remember that when I asked about your interests, you spoke of philosophy and history rather than fashion and gossip, and I found myself actually listening rather than merely waiting for my turn to speak. He paused, cutting a piece of meat with precise movements that belied the emotion in his voice. I remember that you asked me about my father's death, not with the morbid curiosity of a gossip, but with genuine sympathy, and I told you things I had never spoken aloud to anyone. I remember that when the dance ended, I did not want to let you go, and that feeling terrified me more than anything had in my entire life. Eliza felt tears prickling at the backs of her eyes and blinked them away fiercely. She would not cry at a dinner table surrounded by society's watchful eyes, no matter how much his words affected her. I remember those things too, she admitted finally. I remember thinking that I had finally found someone who saw past the surface to the person beneath. I remember going home that night feeling as though something important had begun. And then, Eleanor, I discovered later that your cousin had betrayed your confidence to Lady Margaret. Lord Lancaster's expression darkened with old anger. By the time I learned what had actually happened, the damage was done. Lady Margaret had told me that you were boasting of having captured my interest, that you were planning your trousseau and imagining yourself as the next Countess of Brincliffe. I believed her because it was easier than believing I had genuinely connected with someone, because connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had become intolerable to me after watching my father waste away while I was powerless to help him. It was easier to believe I was cold, Eliza said softly, than to admit you might be warm. Easier to hate you than to want you, he agreed. And so we built our walls, brick by bitter brick, until we were imprisoned by our own construction. A burst of laughter from further down the table interrupted their quiet conversation. Lady Millstone was regaling her guests with some amusing anecdote, and the moment of intimacy between Eliza and Lord Lancaster was temporarily suspended as they were required to smile and nod at the appropriate moments. But beneath the table, in the private darkness concealed by heavy damask, Eliza felt his hand find hers. The touch was light, questioning rather than demanding, and she had a moment to withdraw to maintain the walls that had protected her for so long. Instead, she turned her palm upward, allowing his fingers to intertwine with hers. The contact sent warmth flooding through her system, a rightness that felt like the clicking of a lock finding its key. They sat that way through the remainder of the meal, conducting two conversations simultaneously, the polite, meaningless exchanges required by social obligation, and the silent, profound dialogue of their joined hands beneath the table. When the ladies finally rose to withdraw to the drawing room, leaving the gentlemen to their port and politics, Lord Lancaster's fingers tightened briefly around hers, before releasing. "Meet me in the library," he breathed, so quietly that she might have imagined it. Half an hour. Eliza gave no outward sign of having heard, but as she followed the other ladies from the dining room, her heart hammered with anticipation and fear in equal measure. She was contemplating something reckless, something that could destroy the careful equilibrium she had built over 10 years of solitary dignity. She should return to the drawing room, take her place among the other ladies, and pretend this evening had not shaken the foundations of everything she believed about herself and the man she had considered her enemy. Instead, when the opportunity presented itself, she slipped away from the group and made her way through the darkened corridors of Millstone Hall toward the library. The Millstone Library was a magnificent space, 2 stories of leather-bound volumes rising toward a coffered ceiling, with deep chairs arranged before a fireplace where embers still glowed from the afternoon's fire. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, casting silver patterns across the carpet and illuminating the figure that stood waiting in the shadows. Lord Lancaster turned as she entered, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other across the moonlit room, 2 people standing at the threshold of something that could either heal or destroy them both. You came, he said, and there was wonder in his voice, as though he had not quite believed she would. I came, she agreed, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud in the silence. I should not have. We both know what speculation will arise if we are discovered here alone. I find that I no longer care about speculation. He moved toward her, each step deliberate, controlled, yet somehow conveying an urgency that his careful words did not. I have spent 10 years caring about what society thinks, about maintaining appearances, about protecting myself from the vulnerability of genuine feeling. It has brought me nothing but emptiness and regret. Eliza held her ground as he approached, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. 10 years of enmity had taught her to expect attack from this quarter, and her defences rose automatically even as her heart yearned toward him. What do you want from me, Lord Lancaster? The truth. He stopped an arm's length away, close enough that she could see the rapid pulse at his throat, the slight tremor in his hands that he could not quite control. I want 10 years of truth to replace 10 years of lies. I want to know if what I felt that first night was real or imagined. I want to know if there is any possibility that we might begin again. Begin again? She laughed softly, though there was no humour in the sound. We are not young anymore, my lord. We cannot simply erase a decade of mutual animosity and pretend it never happened. No, he agreed. But perhaps we can build something new upon the ruins of what we destroyed. Perhaps the years of warfare have burned away everything false, leaving only what was true to begin with. And what was true in your estimation? His hand rose slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, and gently touched her cheek. The contact was electric, sending sparks cascading through her nervous system, making her breath come faster and her carefully maintained composure begin to crumble. This, he said softly. This was true. The way my heart races when I am near you. The way your wit makes me feel more alive than I have felt in years. The way I have thought of you every single day since that first meeting, even when I convinced myself it was hatred, rather than something else entirely. Something else. Eliza's voice was barely a whisper, the word he had carefully avoided. The truth they had both been circling for the entire evening hung unspoken in the moonlit air between them. I need you to say it. She had not known she would demand it until the words left her lips. If we are to begin again, if I am to trust you after everything that has passed between us, I need to hear you say the words. Lord Lancaster's grey eyes, usually so cool and controlled, blazed with sudden intensity. I love you, he said, and the words seemed to cost him something, as though they were being torn from behind barriers he had maintained for decades. I have loved you since the moment you looked at me across Lady Pemberton's ballroom and saw not the Earl of Brincliffe but simply a man. I have loved you, through 10 years of pretending I hated you, through every barbed exchange and every cold encounter, through watching you refuse suitor after suitor and telling myself it meant nothing to me. I love your wit, your fire, your stubborn refusal to be anything other than exactly who you are. I love that you have never once, in all our years of warfare, pretended to be less than you are simply to make me more comfortable. The words washed over her like a tide, sweeping away the last of her defences, leaving her exposed and trembling before the magnitude of what he offered. She should be cautious. She should protect herself. She had learned painfully what came of opening her heart to this man. But she was tired. So impossibly tired of fighting, of pretending, of maintaining walls that had kept out joy along with pain, of spending her life alone rather than risk the vulnerability that connection demanded. I love you too, she admitted, and it was simultaneously the hardest and easiest thing she had ever said. I have loved you and hated myself for loving you for 10 wasted years. Then let us waste no more time. His hand slid from her cheek to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her carefully arranged hair, and he drew her toward him with a gentleness that belied the intensity in his eyes. The first touch of his lips against hers was soft, questioning, giving her every opportunity to withdraw. When she did not, when instead she leaned into him, her hands rising to grip the lapels of his coat, the kiss deepened into something transformative. 10 years of enmity dissolved in that kiss, replaced by 10 years of suppressed longing finally given expression. His arms came around her, pulling her close against the solid warmth of his body, and she felt something within her shatter and reform, the broken pieces of her guarded heart, rearranging themselves into a new configuration that included him at its center. When they finally parted, both breathless, foreheads resting together in the moonlit darkness, Eliza felt as though she had been reborn into a world she did not recognize but desperately wanted to explore. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I caught you properly, as I should have done 10 years ago. I apologize publicly for my treatment of you, and make clear to all of society that my regard for you is genuine and permanent. And then, if you will have me, I make you my countess, and spend the rest of my life ensuring you never again have cause to doubt my devotion." It was everything she had secretly dreamed of in the darkest hours of the night. Everything she had told herself was impossible. Foolish, the fantasy of a woman who should have known better. Yet here it was, offered freely by the man she had spent a decade pretending to hate. "Your mother," Eliza said suddenly, remembering what had sparked this transformation. "You said she was dying. She would want to meet you." He pulled back slightly, studying her face in the silver light. She has always regretted that her only son seemed incapable of love. To introduce her to the woman who finally unlocked that capacity, the woman she has heard me speak of for 10 years, even when I claimed to despise you, would bring her great joy in her final days. "Then take me to her," Eliza said simply. "Tomorrow, if possible. Let her see that her son is capable of more than cold duty. Let her know that he has finally found the happiness she wished for him." Lord Lancaster, Marcus, she corrected herself, savouring the intimacy of his given name, stared at her with an expression of such naked wonder that it made her heart ache. "You would do that. You would leave this house party, abandon propriety, travel with me to my estate simply to bring comfort to a dying woman you have never met?" "She is your mother," Eliza replied. "She raised the man I love. Whatever I may have thought of him over the years, whatever bitterness has marked our history, she deserves to know that her faith in him was not misplaced." He kissed her again, harder this time, with a passion that spoke of years of suppressed desire finally breaking free. When he released her, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I do not deserve you," he said roughly. "Perhaps not," she agreed with a flash of her old spirit. "But you have me, nonetheless. Try not to waste the opportunity this time." A sound from the corridor interrupted them, the distant murmur of voices suggesting that the separation of the sexes after dinner was drawing to a close, and guests would soon be seeking entertainment throughout the house. "We should return separately," Marcus said, though his arms seemed reluctant to release her. "If we are to do this properly, we must announce our understanding before engaging in behaviour that would require a hasty wedding." Eliza laughed, the sound lighter and freer than any that had escaped her in years. "After 10 years of scandalous enmity, I hardly think the ton will be surprised by a scandalous courtship." "Perhaps not." He pressed a final kiss to her forehead, lingering, reluctant. "But I find that I want to do right by you, Eliza. I want to give you the courtship you deserve, not the hasty, secretive affair that our history might suggest. I want everyone to know that when I choose you, it is not from desperation or convenience, but from a love that has survived 10 years of trying to destroy it." The sincerity in his voice made her chest ache with an emotion too large to name. "Then court me properly, my lord," she replied softly. "But do not take too long about it. We have already wasted enough time." She slipped from the library first, making her way back to the drawing room with the careful composure of one who had merely stepped out to admire the moonlit gardens. If anyone noticed the heightened colour in her cheeks or the unusual brightness of her eyes, they attributed it to the warmth of the room or the excellent dinner wine. When Marcus returned to the gathering some 20 minutes later, his own composure firmly restored, he sought her out with a directness that raised eyebrows throughout the assembly. "Miss Church," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, "I wonder if I might have the honour of calling on you tomorrow at your family's residence. I find there are matters I wish to discuss with your brother." The words were conventional, but their meaning was unmistakable to everyone present. Lord Lancaster, notorious for his refusal to court anyone, was publicly declaring his intention to pursue Miss Eliza Church, his enemy of 10 years, the woman whose sharp tongue had sparred with his at every encounter. Lady Church nearly fainted from shock. Lady Millstone's eyes went wide with delight at having hosted such a dramatic development, and Eliza, meeting his grey eyes across the crowded room, smiled with a freedom she had not felt since before that fateful night a decade ago. "I should be honoured, my lord," she replied, and watched as the assembled company erupted into whispered speculation that would fuel county gossip for months to come. The scandal of their courtship was only beginning, but for the first time in 10 years, neither of them cared what anyone else might think. They had found each other at last, and nothing would separate them again. 3 months later, Eliza stood at the window of her new chambers in Brincliffe Hall, watching snow fall softly across the estate that was now her home. The wedding had taken place just 2 days prior, a ceremony made bittersweet by the presence of the Dowager Countess, who had rallied enough to witness her son's marriage but now lay peacefully in her chambers, her prayers finally answered. The door opened behind her, and she did not need to turn to know who entered. Marcus's presence announced itself in the quickening of her pulse, in the way the air seemed to warm around her whenever he was near. "Come away from the window," he said softly, his arms encircling her from behind. "You will catch a chill." "I was thinking about your mother," she admitted, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. She seemed so happy at the wedding. She was happy. His voice was rough with emotion. She told me afterward that she could die content now, knowing that I had finally found the courage to love and be loved in return. "She is remarkable," Eliza said. "These past weeks, getting to know her, hearing her stories of you as a child, I understand better now why you became who you are." "And yet she showed you a version of me I thought I had buried beyond reach," Marcus replied. "The version that could laugh and hope and believe in something beyond duty and obligation. I did not realize how much I had lost until you helped me find it again." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the snow transform the world outside into something clean and new. So much had changed in such a short time. The courtship had been intense, compressed into weeks rather, than the months that convention demanded, driven by the urgency of the Dowager's declining health and by their own unwillingness to waste any more time. Society had buzzed with speculation and scandal, but neither had cared. They had found each other against all odds, their enemies to lovers' transformation becoming the most talked about romance of the season. What made it even more delicious to the gossips was the obvious genuineness of their regard. The way they looked at each other across crowded rooms, the easy wit of their public exchanges, the unmistakable intimacy that spoke of souls truly matched. "I received a letter from Eleanor today," Eliza said. "She has heard of my marriage and wishes to offer congratulations." Marcus stiffened almost imperceptibly. "The cousin who betrayed your confidence to Lady Margaret?" "The same." She paused, considering her next words carefully. She says she has long regretted her actions, that she was young and foolish and jealous of what she perceived as my good fortune in attracting your notice. She says she understands if I never wish to speak to her again, but she wanted me to know that she has thought of me often over the years and wished things had been different. And what do you intend to do with this letter? Part of me wants to throw it in the fire, Eliza admitted. Her betrayal cost us 10 years. But then I think of all the ways we betrayed ourselves during that time, all the opportunities we had to question our assumptions and chose instead to nurse our grievances. Are we really so different from her? Marcus turned her gently in his arms, studying her face with the intensity that still made her breath catch even after months of courtship. You are asking whether we should forgive her. I am asking whether holding on to old resentments serves any purpose now that we have found each other. She was a catalyst, not the cause. The cause was our own pride, our own fear. If we can forgive ourselves and each other for 10 wasted years, perhaps we can extend that grace to others as well. He was silent for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with the same conflicting impulses that warred within her own heart. Eleanor's actions had set in motion a decade of pain and isolation, but that decade had also shaped them both, burning away everything superficial until only the essential remained. Finally, he sighed. You are too forgiving for your own good, and you are too stubborn for yours, she replied with a small smile. Together, perhaps, we will find some balance. He kissed her then, a soft, sweet kiss that spoke of commitment rather than passion, of the quiet joy of belonging rather than the urgency of desire. When they parted, she saw peace in his eyes, a contentment that mirrored her own. Will you come with me to see my mother? He asked. She has been asking for you. Of course. Together they made their way through the grand corridors of Brincliffe Hall to the Dowager's chambers, where Margaret Lancaster lay propped against silk pillows, her face pale but serene as she watched the snowfall through her windows. She brightened visibly as they entered, reaching out frail hands toward them both. My children, she said, her voice weak but warm. Come, sit with me. They settled on either side of her bed, each holding one of her hands, a tableau of the family she had always wished for but feared she would never see. I have been thinking, the Dowager continued, of the day Marcus came home from Lady Pemberton's ball all those years ago. Do you remember my son? He glanced at Eliza, his expression soft with memory. I remember. You were different that night, alive in a way I had not seen since before your father's illness. And when you spoke of the young woman you had met, the one with hair like autumn fire and a tongue sharp enough to cut through your defences, I knew. Her faded eyes moved to Eliza. I knew that you were the one who could save him from himself. I told him then that he should pursue you properly, that he should court you with the devotion you deserved. But he was afraid. Marcus's hand tightened on his mother's fingers. I was a fool. Yes. There was no censure in the Dowager's voice, only gentle acknowledgement. But you are not a fool now. You have finally found the courage that fear stole from you. She smiled at Eliza with something approaching maternal love. And you, my dear, you have given me the gift of seeing my son truly happy before I leave this world. I cannot thank you enough. Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes. She had known the Dowager for only a few months, but in that time she had come to understand where Marcus had inherited his capacity for love, carefully hidden though it had been beneath years of protective armour. I promise to care for him, Eliza said softly. To challenge him when he retreats behind his walls, to remind him that vulnerability is strength rather than weakness, to love him as he deserves to be loved. And I, Marcus added, his voice rough with emotion, promise to be worthy of that love, to never again let pride or fear cost me what matters most. The Dowager closed her eyes, her expression peaceful. Then I can rest easy, she murmured. My work here is done. They stayed with her until she drifted into sleep, then slipped quietly from the room, leaning into each other as they walked through the shadowed corridors of their home. "She will not last much longer," Eliza said quietly. "No." Marcus's voice was steady, but she could feel the grief beneath the surface. "But she will go peacefully, knowing that her prayers were answered. That is more than many can hope for." They returned to their chambers where a fire had been built against the evening chill and settled together on the settee before the flames. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white, and inside, two people who had spent 10 years as enemies held each other close and marvelled at the improbable path that had brought them here. "If someone had told me a year ago that I would be married to Lord Lancaster," Eliza mused, "I would have thought them mad. And if someone had told me I would be grateful for every barbed exchange and hostile encounter," Marcus replied, "I would have questioned their sanity. But here we are. Here we are." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Do you have any regrets?" "Only one," she admitted, "that we wasted so much time. But even that regret is tempered by gratitude that we found each other at all. That through all the bitterness and pride, something true survived and waited for us to be ready to claim it." It is strange, he reflected, how the worst moments of our history have become the foundation of our greatest happiness. If we had not been so wounded by that first misunderstanding, if we had not built such elaborate defenses against each other, would we have developed the depth of character that now allows us to appreciate what we have? "Perhaps," Eliza replied thoughtfully. "Or perhaps we would have married young and drifted apart, as so many couples do, never knowing the value of what we possessed. Perhaps it took 10 years of wanting and denying to make us ready for a love that will last." The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing upward into the chimney. Marcus drew her closer, and she nestled into his warmth, feeling more at home than she had ever felt in her life. "I love you," he said, the words coming easier now with practice, though they still carried the weight of revelation each time he spoke them. "I love you too," she replied, "my enemy, my nemesis, my heart." Above them, the Dowager Countess slept peacefully in her chambers, her spirit already beginning its gentle departure, comforted by the knowledge that her son had finally found the love she had always believed was possible for him. And outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of the past, transforming the world into something clean and new, full of possibility and promise, just as their story, forged in conflict and tempered by time, had finally transformed into something beautiful enough to last a lifetime. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We would love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you are listening from and what you liked the most. If you enjoyed this story, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you would like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we will see you in the next story.